A Bear in Hot Water. Paddington wasn't quite sure what to expect when Mrs. Bird opened the door. He was pleasantly surprised when they were greeted by a stout, motherly lady with grey hair and a kindly twinkle in her eyes. When she saw Judy, she raised her hands above her head. "Goodness gracious, you've arrived already," she said in horror, "and me hardly finished the washing up. I suppose you'll be wanting tea." "Hello, Mrs. Bird," said Judy. "It's nice to see you again. How's the rheumatism?" "Worse than it's ever been," began Mrs. Bird. Then she stopped speaking and stared at Paddington. "Whatever have you got there?" she asked. "What is it?" "It's not a what," said Judy. "It's a bear. His name's Paddington." Paddington raised his hat. "A bear?" said Mrs. Bird, doubtfully. "Well, he has good manners, I'll say that for him." "He's going to stay with us," announced Judy. "He's emigrated from South America, and he's all alone with nowhere to go." "Going to stay with us?" Mrs. Bird raised her arms again. "How long for?" Judy looked round mysteriously before replying. "I don't know," she said. "It depends on things." "Mercy me!" exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "I wish you'd told me. I haven't put clean sheets in the spare room or anything." She looked down at Paddington. "Though, judging by the state he's in, perhaps that's as well." "It's all right, Mrs. Bird," said Paddington. "I think I'm going to have a bath. I had an accident with a bun." "Oh!" Mrs. Bird held the door open. "Oh, well, in that case you'd best come on in. Only mind the carpet, it's just been done." Judy took hold of Paddington's paw and squeezed. "She doesn't mind, really," she whispered. "I think she rather likes you." Paddington watched the retreating figure of Mrs. Bird. "She seems a bit fierce," he said. Mrs. Bird turned. "What was that you said?" Paddington jumped. I he began. "Where was it you said you'd come from? Peru?" "That's right," said Paddington. "Darkest Peru." Mrs. Bird looked thoughtful for a moment. "Then I expect you like marmalade." "I'd better get some more from the grocer." "There you are! What did I tell you?" cried Judy as the door shut behind Mrs. Bird. "She does like you." "Fancy her knowing I like marmalade," said Paddington. "Mrs. Bird knows everything about everything," said Judy. "Now, you'd better come upstairs with me and I'll show you your room. It used to be mine when I was small, and it has lots of pictures of bears round the wall, so I expect you'll feel at home." She led the way up a long flight of stairs, chattering all the time. Paddington followed closely behind, keeping carefully to the side so that he didn't have to tread on the carpet. "That's the bathroom," said Judy, "and that's my room, and that's Jonathan's, he's my brother, and you'll meet him soon, and that's Mummy and Daddy's." She opened a door. "And this is going to be yours." Paddington nearly fell over with surprise when he followed her into the room. He had never seen such a big one. There was a large bed with white sheets against one wall and several big boxes, one with a mirror on it. Judy pulled open a drawer in one of the boxes. "This is called a chest of drawers," she said. "You'll be able to keep all your things in here." Paddington looked at the drawer and then at his suitcase. "I don't seem to have very much. That's the trouble with being small. No one ever expects you to want things." "Then we shall have to see what we can do," said Judy mysteriously. "I'll try and get Mummy to take you on one of her shopping expeditions." She knelt down beside him. "Let me help you to unpack." "It's very kind of you," Paddington fumbled with the lock, "but I don't think there's much to help me with. There's a jar of marmalade, only there's hardly any left now, and what there is tastes of seaweed. And my scrapbook, and some centavos. They're a sort of South American penny." "Gosh," said Judy, "I've never seen any of those before. Aren't they bright?" "Oh, I keep them polished," said Paddington. "I don't spend them." He pulled out a tattered photograph. And that's a picture of my Aunt Lucy. She had it taken just before she went into the Home for Retired Bears in Lima." "She looks very nice," said Judy, "and very wise." Seeing that Paddington had a sad, far-away look in his eyes, she added hastily, "Well, I'm going to leave you now so that you can have your bath and come down nice and clean. You'll find 2 taps, one marked hot and one marked cold. There's plenty of soap and a clean towel. Oh, and a brush so that you can scrub your back." "Sounds very complicated," said Paddington. "Can't I just sit in a puddle or something?" Judy laughed. "Somehow, I don't think Mrs. Bird would approve of that. And don't forget to wash your ears. They look awfully black." "They're meant to be black," Paddington called indignantly as Judy shut the door. He climbed up onto a stool by the window and looked out. There was a large, interesting garden below, with a small pond and several trees which looked good for climbing. Beyond the trees, he could see some more houses stretching away into the distance. He decided it must be wonderful living in a house like this all the time. He stayed where he was, thinking about it, until the window became steamed up and he couldn't see out any more. Then he tried writing his name on the cloudy part with his paws. He began to wish it wasn't quite so long, as he soon ran out of cloud, and it was rather difficult to spell. All the same, he climbed onto the dressing table and looked at himself in the mirror. It's a very important name, and I don't expect there are many bears in the world called Paddington. If he'd only known, Judy was saying exactly the same thing to Mr. Brown at that very moment. The Browns were holding a council of war in the dining room, and Mr. Brown was fighting a losing battle. It had been Judy's idea in the first place to keep Paddington. In this, she not only had Jonathan on her side, but also her mother. Jonathan had yet to meet Paddington, but the idea of having a bear in the family appealed to him. It sounded very important. "After all, Henry," argued Mrs. Brown, "you can't turn him out now. It wouldn't be right." Mr. Brown sighed. He knew when he was beaten. It wasn't that he didn't like the idea of keeping Paddington. Secretly, he was just as keen as anyone. But as head of the Brown household, he felt he ought to consider the matter from every angle. "I'm sure we ought to report the matter to someone first," he said. "I don't see why, Dad," cried Jonathan. "Besides, he might get arrested for being a stowaway if we do that." Mrs. Brown put down her knitting. "Jonathan's right, Henry. We can't let that happen. It's not as if he's done anything wrong. I'm sure he didn't harm anyone travelling in a lifeboat like that." "Well, then there's the question of pocket money," said Mr. Brown, weakening. "I'm not sure how much pocket money to give a bear." "He can have £1 a week, the same as the other children," replied Mrs. Brown. Mr. Brown lit his pipe carefully before replying. "Well," he said, "we'll have to see what Mrs. Bird has to say about it first, of course." There was a triumphant chorus from the rest of the family. "You'd better ask her, then," said Mrs. Brown, when the noise had died down. "It was your idea." Mr. Brown coughed. He was a little bit afraid of Mrs. Bird, and he wasn't at all sure how she would take it. He was about to suggest they left it for a little while, when the door opened and Mrs. Bird herself came in with the tea things. She paused for a moment and looked round at the sea of expectant faces. "I suppose," she said, "you want to tell me you've decided to keep that young Paddington." "May we, Mrs. Bird?" pleaded Judy. "Please, I'm sure he'll be very good." Mrs. Bird put the tray down on the table. "That remains to be seen. Different people have different ideas about being good." All the same, she hesitated at the door. "He looks the sort of bear that means well." "Then you don't mind, Mrs. Bird?" Mr. Brown asked her. Mrs. Bird thought for a moment. No, I don't mind at all. I've always had a soft spot for bears myself. It'd be nice to have one about the house." "Well," gasped Mrs. Brown as the door closed. "Whoever would have thought it?" "I expect it was because he raised his hat," said Judy. "It made a good impression. Mrs. Bird likes polite people." Mrs. Brown picked up her knitting again. "I suppose someone ought to write and tell his Aunt Lucy. I'm sure she'd like to know he's safe." She turned to Judy. "Perhaps it would be a nice thought if you and Jonathan wrote." "Oh, by the way," said Mr. Brown, "come to think of it, where is Paddington? He's not still up in his room, is he?" Judy looked up from the writing desk, where she was searching for some notepaper. "Oh, he's all right. He's just having a bath." "A bath?" Mrs. Brown's face took on a worried expression. "He's rather small to be having a bath all by himself." "Don't fuss so, Mary," grumbled Mr. Brown, settling himself down in the armchair with the newspaper. "He's probably having the time of his life." Mr. Brown was fairly near the truth when he said Paddington was probably having the time of his life. Unfortunately, it wasn't in quite the way he meant it. Blissfully unaware that his fate was being decided, Paddington was sitting in the middle of the bathroom floor, drawing a map of South America with a tube of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. Paddington liked geography. At least, he liked his sort of geography, which meant seeing strange places and new people. Before he left South America on his long journey to England, his Aunt Lucy, who was a very wise old bear, had done her best to teach him all she knew. She had told him all about the places he would see on the way, and she had spent many long hours reading to him about the people he would meet. It had been a long journey, halfway round the world, and so Paddington's map occupied most of the bathroom floor, and also used up most of Mr. Brown's shaving cream. With the little that was left, he tried writing his new name again. He had several attempts and finally decided on Paddington. It looked most important. It wasn't until a trickle of warm water landed on his nose that he realized the bath was full and was beginning to run over the side. With a sigh, he climbed up onto the side of the bath, closed his eyes, held his nose with one paw, and jumped. The water was hot and soapy and much deeper than he had expected. In fact, he had to stand on tiptoe even to keep his nose above the surface. It was then that he had a nasty shock. It's one thing getting into a bath. It's quite another getting out. Especially when the water comes up to your nose and the sides are slippery and your eyes are full of soap. He couldn't even see to turn the taps off. He tried calling out, "Help!" first in quite a quiet voice, and then very loudly, "Help! Help!" He waited for a few moments, but no one came. Suddenly he had an idea. What a good thing he was still wearing his hat. He took it off and began bailing out the water. There were several holes in the hat because it was a very old one that had once belonged to his uncle, but if the water didn't get much less, at least it didn't get any more. "That's funny," said Mr. Brown, jumping up from his armchair and rubbing his forehead. "I could have sworn I felt a spot of water." "Don't be silly, dear. How could you?" Mrs. Brown, busy with her knitting, didn't even bother to look up. Mr. Brown grunted and returned to his newspaper. He knew he had felt something, but there was no point in arguing. He looked suspiciously at the children, but both Judy and Jonathan were busy writing their letter. "How much does it cost to send a letter to Lima?" asked Jonathan. Judy was about to reply when another drop of water fell down from the ceiling, this time right onto the table. "Oh, gosh!" She jumped to her feet, pulling Jonathan after her. There was an ominous wet patch right over their heads and right underneath the bathroom. "Where are you going now, dear?" asked Mrs. Brown. "Oh, just upstairs to see how Paddington's getting on." Judy pushed Jonathan through the door and shut it quickly behind them. "Crikey," said Jonathan. "What's up?" "It's Paddington!" cried Judy over her shoulder as she rushed up the stairs. "I think he's in trouble." She ran along the landing and banged loudly on the bathroom door. "Are you all right, Paddington?" she shouted. "May we come in?" "Help! Help!" shouted Paddington. "Please, come in. I think I'm going to drown." "Oh, Paddington!" Judy leant over the side of the bath and helped Jonathan lift a dripping and very frightened Paddington onto the floor. "Oh, Paddington! Thank goodness you're all right." Paddington lay on his back in a pool of water. "What a good job! I had my hat," he panted. "Aunt Lucy told me never to be without it." "But why on earth didn't you pull the plug out, you silly?" said Judy. "Oh." Paddington looked crestfallen. I never thought of that." Jonathan looked admiringly at Paddington. "Crikey," he said. "Fancy you making all this mess! Even I've never made as much mess as this." Paddington sat up and looked around. The whole of the bathroom floor was covered in a sort of white foam where the hot water had landed on his map of South America. "It is a bit untidy," he admitted. "I don't really know how it got like that." "Untidy?" Judy lifted him to his feet and wrapped a towel around him. "Paddington, we've all got a lot of work to do before we go downstairs again. If Mrs. Bird sees this, I don't know what she'll say." "I do," exclaimed Jonathan. "She says it to me sometimes." Judy began wiping the floor with a cloth. "Now, just you dry yourself quickly in case you catch cold." Paddington began rubbing himself meekly with the towel. "I must say," he remarked, looking at himself in the mirror, "I am a lot cleaner than I was. Doesn't look like me at all." Paddington did look much cleaner than when he had first arrived at the Browns. His fur, which was really quite light in colour and not dark brown as it had been, was standing out like a new brush, except that it was soft and silky. His nose gleamed, and his ears had lost all traces of the jam and cream. He was so much cleaner that when he arrived downstairs and entered the dining room some time later, everyone pretended not to recognise him. "The tradesman's entrance is at the side," said Mr. Brown from behind the paper. Mrs. Brown put down her knitting and stared at him. "I think you must have come to the wrong house," she said. "This is number 32, not 34. Even Jonathan and Judy agreed there must be some mistake. Paddington began to get quite worried, until they all burst out laughing and said how nice he looked now that he was brushed and combed and respectable. They made room for him in a small armchair by the fire, and Mrs. Bird came in with another pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast. "Now, Paddington," said Mr. Brown when they were all settled, "suppose you tell us all about yourself, and how you came to Britain." Paddington settled back in his armchair, wiped a smear of butter carefully from his whiskers, put his paws behind his head, and stretched out his toes towards the fire. He liked an audience, especially when he was warm and the world seemed such a nice place. "I was brought up in darkest Peru," he began, "by my Aunt Lucy. She's the one that lives in a home for retired bears in Lima." He closed his eyes thoughtfully. A hush fell over the room, and everyone waited expectantly. After a while, when nothing happened, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown coughed loudly. "It doesn't seem a very exciting story," he said impatiently. He reached across and poked Paddington with his pipe. "Well, I never," he said. "I do believe he's fallen asleep." Paddington Goes Underground. Paddington was very surprised when he woke up the next morning and found himself in bed. He decided it was a nice feeling as he stretched himself and pulled the sheets up round his head with a paw. He reached out with his feet and found a cool spot for his toes. One advantage of being a very small bear in a large bed was that there was so much room. After a few minutes, he poked his head out cautiously and sniffed. There was a lovely smell of something coming under the door. It seemed to be getting nearer and nearer. There were footsteps, too, coming up the stairs. As they stopped by his door, there was a knock, and Mrs. Bird's voice called out, "Are you awake, young Paddington?" "Only just," called out Paddington, rubbing his eyes. The door opened. "You've had a good sleep," said Mrs. Bird, as she placed a tray on the bed and drew the curtains. "And you're a very privileged person to have breakfast in bed on a weekday." Paddington eyed the tray hungrily. There was half a grapefruit in a bowl, a plate of bacon and eggs, some toast, and a whole pot of marmalade, not to mention a large cup of tea. "Is all that for me?" he exclaimed. "If you don't want it, I can soon take it away again," said Mrs. Bird. "Oh, I do," said Paddington hurriedly. "It's just that I've never seen so much breakfast before." "Well, you'd better hurry up with it." Mrs. Bird turned in the doorway and looked back, "because you're going on a shopping expedition this morning with Mrs. Brown and Judy. And all I can say is, thank goodness I'm not going too." She closed the door. "Now I wonder what she means by that," said Paddington. But he didn't worry about it for very long. There was far too much to do. It was the first time he had ever had breakfast in bed, and he soon found it wasn't quite as easy as it looked. First of all, he had trouble with the grapefruit. Every time he pressed it with his spoon, a long stream of juice shot up and hit him in the eye, which was very painful. And all the time he was worried because the bacon and eggs were getting cold. Then there was the question of the marmalade. He wanted to leave room for the marmalade. In the end, he decided it would be much nicer if he mixed everything up on the one plate and sat on the tray to eat it. "Oh, Paddington," said Judy when she entered the room a few minutes later and found him perched on the tray. "Whatever are you doing now? Do hurry up. We're waiting for you downstairs." Paddington looked up, an expression of bliss on his face, that part of his face which could be seen behind egg whiskers and toast crumbs. He tried to say something, but all he could manage was a muffled grunting noise, which sounded like, "I'm just coming," all rolled into one. "Really?" Judy took out her handkerchief and wiped his face. "You're the stickiest bear imaginable, and if you don't hurry up, all the nice things will be gone. Mummy's going to buy you a complete new outfit from Barkridge's. I heard her say so. Now comb your fur quickly and come on down." As she closed the door, Paddington looked at the remains of his breakfast. Most of it was gone, but there was a large piece of bacon left which it seemed a pity to waste. He decided to put it into his suitcase in case he got hungry later on. He hurried into the bathroom and rubbed his face over with some warm water. Then he combed his whiskers carefully, and a few moments later, not looking perhaps as clean as he had done the evening before, but quite smart, he arrived downstairs. "I hope you're not wearing that hat," said Mrs. Brown, as she looked down at him. "Oh, do let him, Mummy," cried Judy. "It's so unusual." "It's unusual, all right," said Mrs. Brown. "I don't know that I've ever seen anything quite like it before. It's such a funny shape. I don't know what you'd call it." "It's a bush hat," said Paddington proudly, "and it saved my life." "Saved your life?" repeated Mrs. Brown. "Don't be silly. How could a hat save your life?" Paddington was about to tell her of his adventure in the bath the evening before when he received a nudge from Judy. She shook her head. It's a long story," he said, lamely. "Then you'd better save it for another time," said Mrs. Brown. "Now come along, both of you." Paddington picked up his suitcase and followed Mrs. Brown and Judy to the front door. By the door, Mrs. Brown paused and sniffed. "That's very strange," she said. "There seems to be a smell of bacon everywhere this morning. Can you smell it, Paddington?" Paddington started. He put the suitcase guiltily behind himself and sniffed. He had several expressions which he kept for emergencies. There was his thoughtful expression, when he stared into space and rested his chin on a paw. Then there was his innocent one, which wasn't really an expression at all. He decided to use this one. "It's very strong," he said truthfully, for he was a truthful bear. And then he added, perhaps not quite so truthfully, "I wonder where it's coming from." "If I were you," whispered Judy as they walked along the road towards the tube station, "I should be more careful in future when you pack your suitcase." Paddington looked down. A large piece of bacon stuck out of the side of his case and was trailing on the pavement. "Shoo!" cried Mrs. Brown as a grubby-looking dog came bounding across the road. Paddington waved his suitcase. "Go away, dog," he said sternly. The dog licked its lips, and Paddington glanced anxiously over his shoulder as he hurried on, keeping close behind Mrs. Brown and Judy. "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Brown, "I have a funny feeling about today, as if things are going to happen. Do you ever have that feeling, Paddington?" Paddington considered for a moment. "Sometimes," he said vaguely as they entered the station. At first, Paddington was a little bit disappointed in the underground. He liked the noise and the bustle and the smell of warm air which greeted him as they went inside, but he didn't think much of the ticket. He examined carefully the piece of green cardboard which he held in his paw. "It doesn't seem much to get for 80 pence, he said. After all the lovely whirring and clanking noises the ticket machine had made, it did seem disappointing. He'd expected much more for 80 pence. "But Paddington," Mrs. Brown sighed, "you only have a ticket so that you can ride on the train. They won't let you on otherwise." She looked and sounded rather flustered. Secretly, she was beginning to wish they had waited until later in the day, when it wasn't quite so crowded. There was also the peculiar business of the dogs. Not one, but 6 dogs of various shapes and sizes had followed them right inside. She had a funny feeling it had something to do with Paddington, but the only time she caught his eye, it had such an innocent expression, she felt quite upset with herself for having such thoughts. "I suppose," she said to Paddington as they stepped on the escalator, "we ought really to carry you. It says you're supposed to carry dogs, but it doesn't say anything about bears." Paddington didn't answer. He was following behind in a dream. Being a very short bear, he couldn't easily see over the side, but when he did, his eyes nearly popped out with excitement. There were people everywhere. He'd never seen so many. There were people rushing down one side, and there were more people rushing up the other. Everyone seemed in a terrible hurry. As he stepped off the escalator, he found himself carried away between a man with an umbrella and a lady with a large shopping bag. By the time he managed to push his way free, both Mrs. Brown and Judy had completely disappeared. It was then that he saw a most surprising notice. He blinked at it several times to make sure, but each time he opened his eyes, it said the same thing. "Follow the amber light to Paddington." Paddington decided the underground was quite the most exciting thing that had ever happened to him. He turned and trotted down the corridor, following the amber lights, until he met another crowd of people who were queuing for the up escalator. "Here," said the man at the top, as he examined Paddington's ticket. "What's all this? We haven't been anywhere yet." "I know," said Paddington unhappily. "I think I must have made a mistake at the bottom." The man sniffed suspiciously and called across to an inspector. "There's a young bear here, smelling of bacon. Says he made a mistake at the bottom." The inspector put his thumbs under his waistcoat. "Escalators is for the benefit and convenience of passengers," he said sternly. "Not for the likes of young bears to play on, especially in the rush hour." "Yes, sir," said Paddington, raising his hat. "But we don't have "Laters," said the inspector, helpfully. "Laters," said Paddington, "in darkest Peru. I've never been on one before, so it's rather difficult." "Darkest Peru?" said the inspector, looking most impressed. "Oh, well, in that case—" He lifted up the chain which divided the up and down escalators. "You'd better get back down, but don't let me catch you up to any tricks again." "Thank you very much," said Paddington gratefully, as he ducked under the chain. "It's very kind of you, I'm sure." He turned to wave goodbye, but before he could raise his hat, he found himself being whisked into the depths of the underground again. Halfway down, he was gazing with interest at the brightly coloured posters on the wall when the man standing behind poked him with his umbrella. "There's someone calling you," he said. Paddington looked round and was just in time to see Mrs. Brown and Judy pass by on their way up. They waved frantically at him, and Mrs. Brown called out "Stop!" several times. Paddington turned and tried to run up the escalator, but it was going very fast, and with his short legs it was as much as he could do even to stand still. He had his head down, and he didn't notice a fat man with a briefcase who was running in the opposite direction until it was too late. There was a roar of rage from the fat man, and he toppled over and grabbed at several other people. Then Paddington felt himself falling. He went bump, 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 all the way down before he shot off the end and finally skidded to a stop by the wall. When he looked round, everything seemed very confused. A number of people were gathered round the fat man, who was sitting on the floor rubbing his head. Away in the distance he could see Mrs. Brown and Judy trying to push their way down the up escalator. It was while he was watching their efforts that he saw another notice. It was in a brass case at the bottom of the escalator, and it said in big red letters, "To stop the escalator in cases of emergency, push the button." It also said in much smaller letters, "Penalty for improper use, £50. But in his hurry, Paddington did not notice this. In any case, it seemed to him very much of an emergency. He swung his suitcase through the air and hit the button as hard as he could. If there had been confusion while the escalator was moving, there was even more when it stopped. Paddington watched with surprise as everyone started running about in different directions, shouting at each other. One man even began calling out, "Fire!" and somewhere in the distance a bell began to ring. He was just thinking what a lot of excitement pressing one small button could cause when a heavy hand descended on his shoulder. "That's him!" someone shouted, pointing an accusing finger. "Saw him do it with my own eyes, as large as life." "Hit it with his suitcase," shouted another voice. "Ought not to be allowed." While from the back of the crowd someone else suggested sending for the police. Paddington began to feel frightened. He turned and looked up at the owner of the hand. "Oh," said a stern voice, "it's you again. I might have known." The inspector took out a notebook. "Name, please." Paddington," said Paddington. "I said, what's your name, not where do you want to go," repeated the inspector. "That's right," said Paddington. "That is my name." "Paddington?" said the inspector, unbelievingly. "It can't be. That's the name of a station. I've never heard of a bear called Paddington before." "It's very unusual," said Paddington, "but it's Paddington Brown, and I live at number 32 Windsor Gardens, and I've lost Mrs. Brown and Judy." "Oh," the inspector wrote something in his book. "Can I see your ticket?" "I had it," said Paddington, "but I don't seem to any more." The inspector began writing again. "Playing on the escalator, travelling without a ticket, stopping the escalator. All serious offences, they are." He looked up. "What have you got to say to that, young fellow, my lad?" "Well, Paddington shifted uneasily and looked down at his paws. "Have you tried looking inside your hat?" asked the inspector, not unkindly. "People often put their tickets in there." Paddington jumped with relief. "I knew I had it somewhere," he said thankfully, as he handed it to the inspector. The inspector handed it back again quickly. The inside of Paddington's hat was rather sticky. "I've never known anyone take so long not to get anywhere," he said, looking hard at Paddington. "Do you often travel on the Underground?" "It's the first time," said Paddington. "And the last, if I have anything to do with it," said Mrs. Brown, as she pushed her way through the crowd. "Is this your bear, madam?" asked the inspector. "Because if it is, I have to inform you that he's in serious trouble." He began to read from his notebook. "As far as I can see, he's broken 2 important regulations, probably more. I shall have to give him into custody." "Oh, dear!" Mrs. Brown clutched at Judy for support. "Do you have to? He's only small, and it's his first time out in London. I'm sure he won't do it again." "Ignorance of the law is no excuse," said the inspector ominously. "Not in court. Persons are expected to abide by the regulations. It says so." "In court?" Mrs. Brown passed a hand nervously over her forehead. The word court always upset her. She had visions of Paddington being taken away in handcuffs and being cross-examined and all sorts of awful things. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw and squeezed it reassuringly. Paddington looked up gratefully. He wasn't at all sure what they were talking about, but none of it sounded very nice. "Did you say persons are expected to abide by the regulations?" Judy asked firmly. "That's right," began the inspector, "and I have my duty to do, the same as everyone else." "But it doesn't say anything about bears?" asked Judy innocently. "Well," the inspector scratched his head, "not in so many words." He looked down at Judy, then at Paddington, and then all around. The escalator had started up again, and the crowd of sightseers had disappeared. "It's all highly irregular," he said, "but—" "Oh, thank you," said Judy. "I think you're the kindest man I've ever met. Don't you think so, Paddington?" Paddington nodded his head vigorously, and the inspector blushed. "I shall always travel on this underground in future," said Paddington politely. "I'm sure it's the nicest in all London." The inspector opened his mouth and seemed about to say something, but he closed it again. "Come along, children," said Mrs. Brown hastily. "If we don't hurry up, we shall never get our shopping done." From somewhere up above came the sound of dogs barking. The inspector sighed. "I can't understand it," he said. "This used to be such a well-run, respectable station. Now look at it." He stared after the retreating figures of Mrs. Brown and Judy, with Paddington bringing up the rear, and then he rubbed his eyes. "That's funny," he said, more to himself. "I must be seeing things. I could have sworn that bear had some bacon sticking out of his case." He shrugged his shoulders. There were more important things to worry about. Judging by the noise coming from the top of the escalator, there was some sort of dogfight going on. It needed investigating. Adventure at the Seaside. One morning, Mr. Brown tapped the barometer in the hall. "It looks as if it's going to be a nice day," he said. "How about a trip to the sea?" His remark was greeted with enthusiasm by the rest of the family, and in no time at all the house was in an uproar. Mrs. Bird started to cut a huge pile of sandwiches, while Mr. Brown got the car ready. Jonathan and Judy searched for their bathing suits, and Paddington went up to his room to pack. An outing which involved Paddington was always rather a business, as he insisted on taking all his things with him. As time went by, he had acquired lots of things. As well as his suitcase, he now had a smart weekend grip with the initials P.B. inscribed on the side and a paper carrier bag for the odds and ends. For the summer months, Mrs. Brown had bought him a sun hat. It was made of straw and very floppy. Paddington liked it, for by turning the brim up or down, he could make it different shapes, and it was really like having several hats in one. "When we get to Brightsea," said Mrs. Brown, "we will buy you a bucket and spade. Then you can make a sand castle." "And you can go to the pier," said Jonathan eagerly. "They've some super machines on the pier. You'd better bring plenty of coins." "And we can go swimming," added Judy. "You can swim, can't you?" "Not very well, I'm afraid," replied Paddington. "You see, I've never been to the seaside before." "Never been to the seaside?" Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at Paddington. "Never," said Paddington. They all agreed that it must be nice to be going to the seaside for the first time in one's life. Even Mrs. Bird began talking about the time she first went to Brightsea many years before. Paddington became very excited as they told him all about the wonderful things he was going to see. The car was crowded when they started off. Mrs. Bird, Judy and Jonathan sat in the back. Mr. Brown drove, and Mrs. Brown and Paddington sat beside him. Paddington liked sitting in the front, especially when the window was open, so that he could poke his head out in the cool breeze. After a minor delay, when Paddington's hat blew off on the outskirts of London, they were soon on the open road. "Can you smell the sea yet, Paddington?" asked Mrs. Brown after a while. Paddington poked his head out and sniffed. "I can smell something," he said. "Well," said Mr. Brown, "keep on sniffing, because we're almost there." And sure enough, as they reached the top of a hill and rounded a corner to go down the other side, there it was in the distance, glistening in the morning sun. Paddington's eyes opened wide. "Look at all the boats on the dirt," he cried, pointing in the direction of the beach with his paw. Everyone laughed. "That's not dirt," said Judy. "That's sand." By the time they had explained all about sand to Paddington, they were in Brightsea itself and driving along the front. Paddington looked at the sea rather doubtfully. The waves were much bigger than he had imagined. Not so big as the ones he'd seen on his journey to England, but quite large enough for a small bear. Mr. Brown stopped the car by a shop on the esplanade and took out some money. "I'd like to fit this bear out for a day at the seaside," he said to the lady behind the counter. "Let's see now. We shall need a bucket and spade, a pair of sunglasses, one of those rubber tyres." As he reeled off the list, the lady handed the articles to Paddington, who began to wish he had more than 2 paws. He had a rubber tyre round his middle, which kept slipping down around his knees, a pair of sunglasses perched precariously on his nose, his straw hat, a bucket and spade in one hand, and his suitcase in the other. "Photograph, sir?" Paddington turned to see an untidy man with a camera looking at him. "Only £1, sir. Results guaranteed. Money back if you're not satisfied." Paddington considered the matter for a moment. He didn't like the look of the man very much, but he had been saving hard for several weeks and now had just over £3. It would be nice to have a picture of himself. "Won't take a minute, sir," said the man, disappearing behind a black cloth at the back of the camera. "Just watch the birdie." Paddington looked around. There was no bird in sight as far as he could see. He went round behind the man and tapped him. The photographer, who appeared to be looking for something, jumped and then emerged from under his cloth. "How do you expect me to take your picture if you don't stand in front?" he said in an aggrieved voice. "Now I've wasted a plate and—" He looked shiftily at Paddington. "That will cost you £1. Paddington gave him a hard stare. "You said there was a bird," he said, "and there wasn't." "I expect it flew away when it saw your face," said the man nastily. "Now where's my £1?" Paddington looked at him even harder for a moment. "Perhaps the bird took it when it flew away," he said. cried another photographer, who had been watching the proceedings with interest. "Fancy you being taken in by a bear, Charlie! Serves you right for trying to take photographs without a licence. Now be off with you, before I call a policeman." He watched while the other man gathered up his belongings and slouched off in the direction of the pier. Then he turned to Paddington. "These people are a nuisance," he said. "Taking away the living from honest folk, you did quite right not to pay him any money. And if you'll allow me, I'd like to take a nice picture of you myself, as a reward." The Brown family exchanged glances. "I don't know," said Mrs. Brown. "Paddington always seems to fall on his feet." "That's because he's a bear," said Mrs. Bird darkly. "Bears always fall on their feet." She led the way onto the beach and carefully laid out a travelling rug on the sand behind a breakwater. "This will be as good a spot as any," she said. "Then we shall all know where to come back to, and no one will get lost." "The tide's out," said Mr. Brown. so it'll be nice and safe for bathing." He turned to Paddington. "Are you going in, Paddington?" he asked. Paddington looked at the sea. "I might go for a paddle," he said. "Well, hurry up," called Judy, "and bring your bucket and spade. Then we can practice making sand castles." "Gosh!" Jonathan pointed to a notice pinned on the wall behind them. "Look, there's a sandcastle competition! Whizzo! First prize £10 for the biggest sandcastle." "Suppose we all join in and make one," said Judy. "I bet the three of us together could make the biggest one you've ever seen." "I don't think you're allowed to," said Mrs. Brown, reading the notice. "It says here, everyone has to make their own." Judy looked disappointed. "Well, I shall have a go anyway. Come on, you two, let's have a bathe first, then we can start digging after lunch." She raced down the sand, closely followed by Jonathan and Paddington. At least, Jonathan followed, but Paddington only got a few yards before his lifebelt slipped down and he went headlong in the sand. "Paddington, do give me your suitcase," called Mrs. Brown. "You can't take it in the sea with you. It'll get wet and be ruined." Looking rather crestfallen, Paddington handed his things to Mrs. Brown for safekeeping, and then ran down the beach after the others. Judy and Jonathan were already a long way out when he got there, so he contented himself with sitting on the water's edge for a while, letting the waves swirl around him as they came in. It was a nice feeling, a bit cold at first, but he soon got warm. He decided the seaside was a nice place to be. He paddled out to where the water was deeper and then lay back in his rubber tire, letting the waves carry him gently back to the shore. £10. Supposing he won 10 whole pounds. He closed his eyes. In his mind he had a picture of a beautiful castle made of sand, like the one he'd once seen in a picture book, with battlements and towers and a moat. It was getting bigger, and everyone else on the beach had stopped to gather round and cheer. Several people said they had never seen such a big sand castle, and— He woke with a start as he felt someone splashing water on him. "Come on, Paddington," said Judy, lying there in the sun fast asleep. "It's time for lunch, and we've lots of work to do afterwards." Paddington felt disappointed. It had been a nice sand castle in his dream. He was sure it would have won first prize. He rubbed his eyes and followed Judy and Jonathan up the beach to where Mrs. Bird had laid out the sandwiches. Ham, egg, and cheese for everyone else, and special marmalade ones for Paddington, with ice cream and fruit salad to follow. "I vote," said Mr. Brown, who had in mind an after-lunch nap for himself, "that after we've eaten, you all go off in different directions and make your own sandcastles. Then we'll have our own private competition as well as the official one. I'll give £1 to the one with the biggest castle." All three thought this was a good idea. "But don't go too far away," called Mrs. Brown as Jonathan, Judy and Paddington set off. "Remember, the tide's coming in." Her advice fell on deaf ears. They were all much too interested in sandcastles. Paddington especially was gripping his bucket and spade in a very determined fashion. The beach was crowded, and he had to walk quite a long way before he found a deserted spot. First of all, he dug a big moat in a circle, leaving himself a drawbridge so that he could fetch and carry the sand for the castle itself. Then he set to work, carrying bucket-loads of sand to build the walls of the castle. He was an industrious bear, and even though it was hard work and his legs and paws soon got tired, he persevered until he had a huge pile of sand in the middle of his circle. Then he set to work with his spade, smoothing out the walls and making the battlements. They were very good battlements, with holes for windows and slots for the archers to fire through. When he had finished, he stuck his spade in one of the corner towers, placed his hat on top of that, and then lay down inside, next to his marmalade jar, and closed his eyes. He felt tired, but very pleased with himself. With the gentle roar of the sea in his ears, he soon went fast asleep. "We've been all along the beach," said Jonathan. and we can't see him anywhere." "He didn't even have his lifebelt with him," said Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Nothing, just a bucket and spade." The Browns were gathered in a worried group round the man from the life-saving hut. "He's been gone several hours," said Mr. Brown, "and the tide's been in over 2. The man looked serious. "And you say he can't swim?" he asked. "He doesn't even like having a bath much," said Judy, "so I'm sure he can't swim." "Here's his photograph," said Mrs. Bird. "He only had it taken this morning." She handed the man Paddington's picture, and then dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. "I know something's happened to him. He wouldn't have missed tea unless something was wrong." The man looked at the picture. "We could send out a description," he said dubiously. "But it's a job to see what he looks like by that. It's all hat and dark glasses." "Can't you launch a lifeboat?" asked Jonathan, hopefully. "We could," said the man, "if we knew where to look, but he might be anywhere." "Oh, dear." Mrs. Brown reached for her handkerchief as well. "I can't bear to think about it." "Something will turn up," said Mrs. Bird comfortingly. "He's got a good head on his shoulders." "Well," said the man, holding up a dripping straw hat, "you'd better have this, and in the meantime we'll see what we can do." There, Mary." Mr. Brown held his wife's arm. "Perhaps he just left it on the beach or something. It may have got picked up by the tide." He bent down to pick up the rest of Paddington's belongings. They seemed very small and lonely, lying there on their own. "It's Paddington's hat, all right," said Judy, examining it. "Look, it's got his mark inside." She turned the hat inside out and showed them the outline of a paw mark in black ink and the words, "My hat, Paddington." "I vote we all separate," said Jonathan, "and comb the beach. We'll stand more chance that way." Mr. Brown looked dubious. "It's getting dark," he said. Mrs. Bird put down the travelling rug and folded her arms. "Well, I'm not going back until he's found," she said. "I couldn't go back to that empty house, not without Paddington." "No one's thinking of going back without him, Mrs. Bird," said Mr. Brown. He looked helplessly out to sea. "It's just—" "Perhaps he didn't get swept out to sea," said the life-saving man helpfully. "Perhaps he's just gone on the pier or something. There seems to be a big crowd heading that way. Must be something interesting going on." He called out to a man who was just passing. "What's going on at the pier, chum?" Without stopping, the man looked back over his shoulder and shouted, "Chap just crossed the Atlantic all by himself on a raft. 100s of days without food or water, so they say." He hurried on. The life-saving man looked disappointed. "Another of these publicity stunts," he said. "We get 'em every year." Mr. Brown looked thoughtful. "I wonder," he said, looking in the direction of the pier. "It would be just like him," said Mrs. Bird. "It's the sort of thing that would happen to Paddington." "It's got to be," cried Jonathan. "It's just got to be." They all looked at each other and then, picking up their belongings, joined the crowd hurrying in the direction of the pier. It took them a long time to force their way through the turnstile, for the news that something was happening on the pier had spread, and there was a great throng at the entrance. But eventually, after Mr. Brown had spoken to a policeman, a way was made for them, and they were escorted to the very end, where the paddle steamers normally tied up. A strange sight met their eyes. Paddington, who had just been pulled out of the water by a fisherman, was sitting on his upturned bucket, talking to some reporters. Several of them were taking photographs, while the rest fired questions at him. "Have you come all the way from America?" asked one reporter. The Browns, hardly knowing whether to laugh or cry, waited eagerly for Paddington's reply. "Well, no," said Paddington truthfully, after a moment's pause. "Not America, but I've come a long way." He waved a paw vaguely in the direction of the sea. "I got caught by the tide, you know." "And you sat in that bucket all the time?" asked another man, taking a picture. "That's right," replied Paddington, "and I used my spade as a paddle. It was lucky I had it with me." Did you live on plankton? Queried another voice. Paddington looked puzzled. No, he said. Marmalade. Mr. Brown pushed his way through the crowd. Paddington jumped up and looked rather guilty. Now then, said Mr. Brown, taking his paw, that's enough questions for today. This bear's been at sea for a long time, and he's tired. In fact, he looked meaningfully at Paddington, he's been at sea all the afternoon. Is it still only Tuesday? Asked Paddington innocently. I thought it was much later than that. Tuesday, said Mr. Brown firmly, and we've been worried to death over you. Paddington picked up his bucket and spade and jar of marmalade. Well, he said, I bet not many bears have gone to sea in a bucket, all the same. It was dark when they drove along Brightsea Front on their way home. The promenade was festooned with coloured lights, and even the fountains in the gardens kept changing colour. It all looked very pretty. But Paddington, who was lying in the back of the car wrapped in a blanket, was thinking of his sand castle. I bet mine was bigger than anyone else's, he said sleepily. Bet you mine was the biggest, said Jonathan. I think, said Mr. Brown hastily, you'd all better have a pound, just to make sure. Perhaps we can come again another day, said Mrs. Brown. Then we can have another competition. How about that, Paddington? There was no reply from the back of the car. Sand castles, paddling his bucket all across the harbour, and the sea air had proved too much for Paddington. He was fast asleep. A disappearing trick. Oh, said Paddington. Is it really for me? He stared hungrily at the cake. It really was a wonderful cake, one of Mrs. Bird's best. It was covered with sugar icing, and it had a cream and marmalade filling. On the top there was one candle and the words, "To Paddington, with best wishes for a happy birthday, from everyone." It had been Mrs. Bird's idea to have a birthday party. Paddington had been with them for 2 months. No one, not even Paddington, knew quite how old he was, so they decided to start again and call him 1. Paddington thought this was a good idea, especially when he was told that bears had 2 birthdays every year, one in the summer and one in the winter. "Just like the Queen," said Mrs. Bird. "So you ought to consider yourself very important." Paddington did. In fact, he went round to Mr. Gruber straight away and told him the good news. Mr. Gruber looked impressed and was pleased when Paddington invited him to the party.
"It's not often anyone invites me out, Mr. Brown," he said. "I don't know when I went out last, and I shall look forward to it very much indeed."
He didn't say any more at the time, but the next morning a van drew up outside the Browns' house and delivered a mysterious-looking parcel from all the shopkeepers in the Portobello market. "Aren't you a lucky bear?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown when they opened the parcel and saw what was inside. It was a nice new shopping basket on wheels, with a bell on the side that Paddington could ring to let people know he was coming. Paddington scratched his head. "It's a job to know what to do first," he said, as he carefully placed the basket with the other presents. "I shall have a lot of thank-you letters to write." "Perhaps you'd better leave them until tomorrow," said Mrs. Brown hastily. Whenever Paddington wrote any letters, he generally managed to get more ink on himself than on the paper, and he was looking so unusually smart, having had a bath the night before, that it seemed a pity to spoil it. Paddington looked disappointed. He liked writing letters. "Perhaps I can help Mrs. Bird in the kitchen," he said hopefully. "I'm glad to say," said Mrs. Bird as she emerged from the kitchen, "that I've just finished. But you can lick the spoon if you like." She had bitter memories of other occasions when Paddington had helped in the kitchen. "But not too much," she warned, "or you won't have room for this." It was then that Paddington saw his cake for the first time. His eyes, usually large and round, became so much larger and rounder that even Mrs. Bird blushed with pride. "Special occasions demand special things," she said, and hurried off in the direction of the dining room. Paddington spent the rest of the day being hurried from one part of the house to another as preparations were made for his party. Mrs. Brown was busy tidying up. Mrs. Bird was busy in the kitchen. Jonathan and Judy were busy with the decorations. Everyone had a job, except Paddington. "I thought it was supposed to be my birthday," he grumbled, as he was sent packing into the drawing-room for the 5th time after upsetting a box of marbles over the kitchen floor. "So it is, dear," said a flustered Mrs. Brown, "but your time comes later." She was beginning to regret telling him that bears had 2 birthdays every year, for already he was worrying about when the next one was due. "Now just you watch out of the window for the postman," she said, lifting him up onto the window-sill. But Paddington didn't seem very keen on this. "Or else," she said, "practice doing some of your conjuring tricks, ready for this evening." Among Paddington's many presents was a conjuring outfit from Mr. and Mrs. Brown. It was a very expensive one from Barkridge's. It had a special magic table, a large mystery box which made things disappear if you followed the instructions properly, a magic wand, and several packs of cards. Paddington emptied them all over the floor and settled down in the middle to read the book of instructions. He sat there for a long time, studying the pictures and diagrams and reading everything twice to make sure. Every now and then he absent-mindedly dipped a paw into his marmalade pot, and then, remembering it was his birthday and that there was a big tea to come, he reached up and stood the jar on the magic table before returning to his studies. The first chapter was called Spells. It showed how to wave the magic wand and the correct way to say abracadabra. Paddington stood up, clutching the book in one paw, and waved the wand several times through the air. He also tried saying abracadabra. He looked round. Nothing seemed to have changed, and he was just about to try again when his eyes nearly popped out of his head. The jar of marmalade which he'd placed on the magic table only a few minutes before had disappeared. He searched hurriedly through the book. There was nothing about making marmalade disappear. Worse still, there was nothing about making it come back again, either. Paddington decided it must be a very powerful spell to make a whole pot vanish into thin air. He was about to rush outside and tell the others when he thought better of it. It might be a good trick to do in the evening, especially if he could persuade Mrs. Bird to give him another jar. He went out into the kitchen and waved his wand a few times in Mrs. Bird's direction, just to make sure. "I'll give you abracadabra," said Mrs. Bird, pushing him out again. "And be careful with that stick, or you'll have someone's eye out." Paddington returned to the drawing-room and tried saying his spell backwards. Nothing happened, so he started reading the next chapter of the instruction book, which was called The Mystery of the Disappearing Egg. "I shouldn't have thought you needed a book to tell you that," said Mrs. Bird at lunchtime, as Paddington told them all about it. "The way you gobble your food is nobody's business." "Well," said Mr. Brown, "so long as you don't try sawing anyone in half this evening, I don't mind. I was only joking," he added hurriedly, as Paddington turned an inquiring gaze on him. Nevertheless, as soon as lunch was over, Mr. Brown hurried down the garden and locked up his tools. With Paddington, there was no sense in taking chances. As it happened, he had no cause to worry, for Paddington had far too many things on his mind, what with one thing and another. The whole family were there for tea, as well as Mr. Gruber. Several other people came along too, including the Browns' next-door neighbour, Mr. Curry. The last named was a most unwelcome visitor. "Just because there's a free tea," said Mrs. Bird, "I think it's disgusting, taking the crumbs off a young bear's plate like that. He's not even been invited." "He'll have to look slippy if he gets any crumbs off Paddington's plate," said Mr. Brown. "All the same, it is a bit thick, after all the things he's said in the past. And not even bothering to wish him many happy returns." Mr. Curry had a reputation in the neighbourhood for meanness and for poking his nose into other people's business. He was also very bad-tempered, and was always complaining about the least little thing which met with his disapproval. In the past, that had often included Paddington, which was why the Browns had not invited him to the party. But even Mr. Curry had no cause to complain about the tea. From the huge birthday cake down to the last marmalade sandwich, everyone voted it was the best tea they had ever had. Paddington himself was so full he had great difficulty in mustering enough breath to blow out the candle. But at last he managed it without singeing his whiskers, and everyone, including Mr. Curry, applauded and wished him a happy birthday. "And now," said Mr. Brown, when the noise had died down, "if you'll all move your seats back, I think Paddington has a surprise for us." While everyone was busy moving their seats to one side of the room, Paddington disappeared into the drawing-room and returned, carrying his conjuring outfit. There was a short delay while he erected his magic table and adjusted the mystery box, but soon all was ready. The lights were turned off except for a standard lamp, and Paddington waved his wand for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, consulting his instruction book, "my next trick is impossible." "But you haven't done one yet," grumbled Mr. Curry. Ignoring the remark, Paddington turned over the page. "For this trick," he said, "I shall require an egg." "Oh, dear," said Mrs. Bird, as she hurried out to the kitchen. "I know something dreadful's going to happen." Paddington placed the egg in the centre of his magic table and covered it with a handkerchief. He muttered "Abracadabra" several times, and then hit the handkerchief with his wand. Mr. and Mrs. Brown looked at each other. They were both thinking of their carpet. "Hey, presto!" said Paddington, and pulled the handkerchief away. To everyone's surprise, the egg had completely disappeared. "Of course," said Mr. Curry knowledgeably above the applause, "it's all done by sleight of paw, but very good, though, for a bear. Very good indeed. Now make it come back again." Feeling very pleased with himself, Paddington took his bow and then felt in the secret compartment behind the table. To his surprise, he found something much larger than an egg. In fact, it was a jar of marmalade. It was the one that had disappeared that very morning. He displayed it in his paw. The applause for this trick was even louder. "Excellent," said Mr. Curry, slapping his knee. "Making people think he was going to find an egg, and it was a jar of marmalade all the time. Very good indeed." Paddington turned over a page. "And now," he announced, flushed with success, "the disappearing trick." He took a bowl of Mrs. Brown's best flowers and placed them on the dining table alongside his mystery box. He wasn't very happy about this trick, as he hadn't had time to practice it, and he wasn't at all sure how the mystery box worked, or even where you put the flowers to make them disappear. He opened the door in the back of the box and then poked his head round the side. "I shan't be a minute," he said, and then disappeared from view again. The audience sat in silence. "Rather a slow trick, this one," said Mr. Curry after a while. "I hope he's all right," said Mrs. Brown. "He seems very quiet." "Well, he can't have gone far," said Mr. Curry. "Let's try knocking." He got up, knocked loudly on the box, and then put his ear to it. "I can hear someone calling," he said. "It sounds like Paddington. I'll try again." He shook the box, and there was an answering thump from inside.
"I think he's shut himself in,"
said Mr. Gruber. He too knocked on the box and called out,
"Are you all right, Mr. Brown?"
"No," said a small and muffled voice. "It's dark." and I can't read my instruction book." "Quite a good trick," said Mr. Curry some while later, after they had prized open Paddington's mystery box with a penknife. He helped himself to some biscuits. "The disappearing bear. Very unusual. But I still don't see what the flowers were for." Paddington looked at him suspiciously, but Mr. Curry was far too busy with the biscuits. "For my next trick," said Paddington, "I would like a watch." "Are you sure?" asked Mrs. Brown anxiously. "Wouldn't anything else do?" Paddington consulted his instruction book. "It says a watch," he said firmly. Mr. Brown hurriedly pulled his sleeve down over his left wrist. Unfortunately, Mr. Curry, who was in an unusually good mood after his free tea, stood up and offered his. Paddington took it gratefully and placed it on the table. "This is a jolly good trick," he said, reaching down into his box and pulling out a small hammer. He covered the watch with a handkerchief and then hit it several times. Mr. Curry's expression froze. "I hope you know what you're doing, young bear," he said. Paddington looked rather worried. Having turned over the page, he'd just read the ominous words, "It is necessary to have a second watch for this trick." Gingerly, he lifted up a corner of the handkerchief. Several cogs and some pieces of glass rolled across the table. Mr. Curry let out a roar of wrath. "I think I forgot to say abracadabra," faltered Paddington. "Abracadabra!" shouted Mr. Curry, beside himself with rage. "Abracadabra!" He held up the remains of his watch. 20 years I've had this watch, and now look at it. This will cost someone a pretty penny." Mr. Gruber took out an eyeglass and examined the watch carefully.
"Nonsense," he
said, coming to Paddington's rescue.
"It's one you bought from me for £3 6 months ago. You ought to be ashamed of yourself, telling lies in front of a young bear."
"Rubbish!" spluttered Mr. Curry. He sat down heavily on Paddington's chair. "Rubbish! I'll give you—" His voice trailed away, and a peculiar expression came over his face. "I'm sitting on something," he said. "Something wet and sticky." "Oh dear," said Paddington. "I expect it's my disappearing egg. It must have reappeared." Mr. Curry grew purple in the face. "I've never been so insulted in my life," he said. "Never!" He turned at the door and waved an accusing finger at the company. "It's the last time I shall ever come to one of your birthday parties." "Henry," said Mrs. Brown, as the door closed behind Mr. Curry, "you really oughtn't to laugh." Mr. Brown tried hard to keep a straight face. "It's no good," he said, bursting out. I can't help it."
"Did you see his face when all the cogs rolled out?"
said Mr. Gruber, his face wet with tears. "All the same," said Mr. Brown, when the laughter had died down, "I think perhaps you ought to try something a little less dangerous next time, Paddington."